966.
Welcome. We're just absolutely delighted to be joined today by Antonia Carver. She is director of Art Jameel, which is an extraordinary initiative that actually has a Dubai presence as well as a Jeddah presence. We sort of started talking about this some time back, and so we're really pleased that we're able to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Richard. Delighted.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. There's so much going on in the art scene in Saudi Arabia now, and I think you can trace certainly much of this back to the Art Jameel initiative. And I want to get to all that. I want to get to the Abdulatif Jameel, what they've done for the community, as well as Art Jameel. But let's talk about your beginnings and how you got interested in this field and your origins, as it were.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I mean, I'm a big fan, and obviously you've interviewed so many incredible people working in Saudi and working in the Gulf over the years. So really happy to be part of this kind of alumni of the 966. So yeah, I studied at the University of Edinburgh in the early 90s, and I just opted for social science. I'd always been interested in the arts, but I kind of thought anthropology and sociology would suit me fine, but then managed to kind of shoehorn art into my anthropology degree and did my thesis on Aboriginal artists in Australia that were working in cities and kind of navigate, really interesting, sort of looking at Indigenous politics and how the presence of art and culture and how that kind of field enabled a different kind of conversation about art and identity, Blackness, and kind of contemporary ethnicities and politics in Australia. So I guess for me, the route into art was always from the angle of what does it mean to the community? What does it mean to the artist? Not only here's a pretty picture on the wall, but more kind of about the questions and the debates that come out of art making. And for me, that's never stopped really. So yeah, it's been since I graduated in 1994 and have ever since kind of worked in some field in the arts, from publishing to exhibitions to film festivals to community events, and always just kind of thinking, how can art broker a conversation, basically?
Well, you answered the question right out of the gate, because your master's is in social anthropology. So the interest in Australia and Aboriginal, aspects of that. So how did you end up out in Dubai and the Middle East?
Yeah, good question. Well, I came back to London. I lived in Australia for a while, and then came back to London in the kind of mid to late 90s, and started working then at the Institute of International Visual Arts, INIVA, it's acronym, in London. And that organization was looking particularly at how London as a city was becoming a multi-ethnic city, and this hadn't been really recognized in the arts. So INIVA was a kind of very flexible think tank type of model that went into different organizations and worked with them to think through the kind of future of the arts and looking at the arts as a multi-ethnic space.
So just for context, just for context, I hate to interrupt. This is the early aughts, right? This is 2000.
Yeah, this is earlier. This is kind of 1997, 98, around that kind of time. And, London was coming out of what was known as the Black British art movement and into the kind of new understanding of itself as a multi-ethnic city. So I started through that, getting to know some artists that were from Iran and the Arab world that were based in the UK, and then started also looking at film practice. So I started working with the Edinburgh Film Festival and curating films for them from what became the kind of Middle East kind of focus. So then, by the kind of late 90s, I was working in publishing as well. And, by the sort of early 2000s, began to get sort of slightly itchy feet. And, London's a kind of city that you can work in for a while, and sometimes you just need a bit of a breather from that kind of environment. And my husband is a journalist. He specializes in the Arab world as well. So we kind of thought, let's go and check out this city that everybody's talking about, Dubai, which is becoming a center not only for the media, but also for the arts and let's, we imagined a couple of years and then we'll move on to somewhere. At that time we thought Beirut or somewhere like that, where I think that's where the action is. And then very quickly when we got to Dubai, we realized that this was a city that was really booming and attracting people from all over the world. It was a real kind of becoming a real center for the Arab world and South Asia. So people were kind of gathering there, and just a hugely exciting place to be.
Well, this is fascinating, and I want our listeners and our viewers to understand, your time and place. We had, I don't know if you know Todd Albert Nims, who we had on an earlier episode, and it was fun to go with him through the comedy scene and the art cinema scene and that sort of thing, and now the theater scene. Where he was sort of there when it was all coming together. So you're here in Dubai. This is 2003 when you first arrived.
Yeah, 2001.
2001.
So just after 9/11, we moved to Dubai at that point. And yeah, I mean, those early 2000s were really a kind of roller coaster in Dubai. It was a kind of, I mean, the UAE generally, but particularly sort of around Dubai. And if you can imagine a kind of a time when, higher education, the opportunities in higher education were growing very rapidly. You had the first kind of graduates coming through from the universities that had been set up in the late 90s in the UAE. You also had this kind of time when, just to be very frank, it was very difficult for a lot of young people from the Arab world and people from different Muslim communities at that time to travel to the States to study.
Right.
It was very difficult for people to get visas. So there was this kind of homecoming in a way in 2000 the early sort of 2000s, and a lot of people who would have gone and studied abroad decided instead to study in universities in the Gulf, and particularly in Dubai at that time. And you also had a kind of generation that had gone away to study in the late 90s because there weren't arts programs available at that time, so they'd gone and studied in America, in Europe, and they'd come back to the Gulf as well with this kind of idea of, let's make our own, New York in the Gulf. Let's make a place that's full of culture, that has this kind of vibrancy. So a lot of movement started in those kind of early years, and I was part of this collective called Bidoon, and riffing off the word meaning without,
right,
in Arabic and also in Farsi, and kind of thinking about what it is to be without a very specific home. So it was really kind of tapping into that generation that saw themselves as having one foot somewhere, one foot somewhere else, that were determined to make Dubai their own city and to really become kind of cultural stakeholders in their own city. So we set up, club nights and photography exhibitions and meeting points and collectives. And out of that came Bidoon magazine, which launched in 2003. And at the same time, I was working for the art newspaper, reporting on what was happening in the arts, and also for Screen International, which is a film magazine. And in 2003, Dubai Film Festival also started, and I was part of the founding programming team for that, and particularly working on Arab film and Iranian film for Dubai Film Festival, selecting the films. So it was a time of sort of big shifts and a lot of kind of ground up energy, particularly in Dubai. And then over the years, towards the kind of mid 2000s, came the plans in Abu Dhabi for Saadiyat Island, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, the Guggenheim. There was that kind of vision sort of started up at that point. And then in Qatar, things began moving as well. You had sort of stirrings of people understanding, that there was this hugely vibrant arts movement in Saudi as well through the work of Edge of Arabia, which was, the international community understanding, what was going on in Saudi, which was something that Art Jameel was involved in. I wasn't at that time part of Art Jameel, but we were observing and celebrating this great kind of movement. So the reason I brought up the kind of universities and young people moving into the city is just sometimes this sort of perfect storm develops where you have the rise of higher education, and cities that have really vibrant university campuses always, have a special kind of boost when it comes to the arts. You had this kind of groundswell of people thinking about how can we express ourselves in our own terms from the Gulf, not what's imposed from outside, but how do we tell the world who we are and how we live and what we want to be. And then alongside that, you have the establishment of Dubai Media City, so people working in advertising, magazines, newspapers, in design, all sort of setting up shop. CNN moving in, you know, everybody kind of setting up shop in Dubai. And then alongside that, the Dubai Financial Center, so people who work in banking and, you know, convened in Dubai from across the Arab world and South Asia. And a lot of these families were people who'd always been interested in the arts in their own hometown. So they kind of naturally became these kind of supporters and people that were interested in sort of really investing in the arts and getting involved. So it was, yeah, there's a lot more to say. I don't know whether to go into.
Well, that's fascinating, and it's really curious listening to you speak, because clearly the Dubai phenomenon, you know, that began in the early 2000s, and everybody watched from afar. But you're on the ground there, and it seems like a whole ferment of not only expats, but significantly and most importantly Emiratis. But there also seems to be an overlay of policy that, you know, came in and said, okay, this is important to our growth. This is important to our identity. We're going to support it. Is that accurate?
I think so. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it was also a time when, you know, the Gulf itself was beginning to, all the different countries of the Gulf and the different scenes, very different from each other, obviously. You know, if you compare Kuwait to UAE or Saudi, very different kind of set of realities. But there was a kind of idea that the Gulf states could act in a very particular way to bring people together. So you had this kind of ground up movement and this kind of, you know, establishment of gathering spaces that brought together people from across the Arab world with other people from the wider Middle East and from South Asia, and then their kind of international counterparts. That the Gulf states could act in this very particular way to really create very meaningful gathering places that were much more difficult elsewhere for various different geopolitical reasons, basically. And then, you know, they could create these kind of gathering points, and then they could also become places of knowledge production that, you know, and I think that was the hardest nut to crack, because internationally people understood, oh, you can go to places like Dubai or Abu Dhabi and nowadays to Riyadh and to Jeddah, and you can meet a really interesting cross-section of people that you never meet anywhere else. But what they didn't quite understand, and really is only really coming to fruition today, really, is this idea that you can develop and grow particular systems of knowledge and of, you know, kind of original ideas when it comes to culture that really don't exist anywhere else. So that was a kind of a later kind of development. But what happened in the mid 2000s was then, yeah, exactly as you said, you know, the governments of the Gulf, particularly the UAE, and then later with Qatar and now with Saudi, began to recognize that culture, within culture, you can have a very particular conversation that's really tricky to have elsewhere. You can open up doors for really kind of meaningful exchange. And basically, I mean, governments started to use this word soft power. You know, how can the arts be kind of a new way of projecting who we are? And we know, you know, just to be, I mean, we can be really honest on this podcast, you know, that it wasn't an easy ride at that time, you know, post 9/11 through the 2000s, the Arab world from the outside was viewed in a very particular way, quite often a very limited way. And people were very used to seeing on their TV screens images of war and, you know, kind of crisis, but they weren't used to seeing projected from to the outside these ideas of incredibly deep and meaningful cultural history and contemporary practitioners who are doing extraordinary things. So it was a real switch in the conversation. Suddenly we were talking about painters, dancers, you know, filmmakers, and people being incredibly creative, often against all the odds. And that was a complete change in the conversation. It took a lot of banging on doors to get people to take notice and to want to have a kind of positive, you know, story coming out of the Middle East. But I think I'm obviously incredibly biased, but I think art and culture really brought a whole new conversation out into the world and enabled people to see people from the Middle East in an entirely new light.
Well, there's so many themes in what that was wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
The convening power, when you make a place welcome and open, the convening power, the sense of building a new identity, the awareness of soft power. And we sort of see history repeating itself in certain ways. This is vocabulary that you can apply in significant ways to Saudi Arabia today. But let's bring you back. Let's follow you until you come back to Jeddah, in essence. So one of the significant elements of soft power was that Dubai Film Festival, which you
Yeah.
were a part of. I mean, and I say that because this is the sort of thing, because we're all sort of media, we're besieged with media and celebrity and this and that sort of thing. But that's the sort of thing that would seep into a normal person's conscious outside of the Emirates. You know, there were
So
celebrities, there were known people going to be part of this big thing, and you were part of this big thing.
yeah, no, it was an absolute blast, I have to say. I mean, when we started in 2003, it seemed like an impossible task to have the first sort of outside of Cairo, to have a first international film festival in the Arab world, and one that really not only attracted celebrities from Hollywood and Bollywood, but also projected a new kind of geography of the world, not new
Right,
geography, but a
right.
geography that was newly understood for the first time. So, films from across Africa, from the Middle East, from Iran, from South Asia. So, really, very quickly, Dubai Film Festival became the place to come and discover films from the global south, basically, and all sorts of films, documentaries, shorts, features, And so you'd have this extraordinary kind of, we're going back to the same thing again, about this kind of extraordinary sense of exchange and a gathering point where you have, George Clooney on the red carpet, and then you have, a first-time filmmaker coming from Nigeria, and you have, Bollywood stars, and then you have documentaries on what was happening in Palestine, or, the Iraq war years. This was going all the way through that period too. So people kind of really telling it like it is, and showing films that were from that perspective, from the ground up again, but matched with these incredible nights of global premieres where you'd have the most glamorous crowd ever. So it was a really kind of real kind of juxtaposition of all these different types of positions that can happen in film. And I think one of the most exciting things that came out of that was not only the glamour and incredible kind of legacy of Dubai Film Festival, because alongside it, I mean, you had things like the world premiere of Wajda, the Haifa Mansour film out of Saudi, that then went on to be a massive global success. It won its first
Mm-hmm.
award at Dubai Film Festival. So you had all this kind of investment in production and investment in homegrown talent. But then on the every Dubai Film Festival was every December, but every kind of spring we started this Gulf Film Festival. So this was saying, okay, we have this massive international platform which brings all these kind of stars to the city and really reinvents the kind of identity of what Dubai was, and the kind of people that can hang out there right on the global stage. But then we also set up this Gulf Film Festival, which had a completely different vibe. Arabic was definitely the first language. We invited film makers from all the different Gulf states, and everybody met up there. Most of the films were short films, but over the years, features started to come through.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a real, like, homegrown kind of atmosphere where most of the filmmakers were young. They were all in their kind of 20s and 30s. We'd sort of, I was, quite often there were very few people that didn't speak Arabic. It was a real kind of very much a homegrown crowd. Everyone would stay up all night, drinking tea and smoking endless packets of cigarettes, and sort of, dissecting their films and getting together with each other. So had this tremendously sort of old school, yet incredibly productive atmosphere. And out of that came amazing scripts. There's still filmmakers now that I see making features in Saudi who are part of that original movement. And at that time, if we're just, touching on Saudi, there wasn't the infrastructure in Saudi at that time. There were, obviously, this was pre the rebirth of cinemas, way pre. So people were doing things DIY themselves with their friends, getting together, making short films, uploading them to YouTube, bringing their films with them to the Gulf Film Festival to discuss with their friends from across the Gulf. And, it was an incredibly vibrant atmosphere. And I remember that time there was a kind of, perception from expats living in the UAE or across the Gulf, that we were somehow living in a non-critical society. And I used to say to them, just come and see a bunch of short filmmakers, at the Gulf Film Festival, and you'll have to eat your words and your hats as well, because, you had the most kind of vibrantly critical atmosphere there. People would show their films. The Q&A session would go on for hours. Everyone would dissect them and then say, hey, I'll help you. I think your music and your film is terrible. I know a friend who's a composer. Let me help you rework your film. So it was this very kind of vibrant, productive atmosphere that really, a lot of people coming to it would say, I feel like I've been to film school for a week. But the most intense kind of film education you can ever receive, in my own language, with my own kind of comrades who share this kind of passion for film and culture from the Gulf, that speaks to the Gulf, that has Gulf characters, actors, everybody. So for me, it was one of the most kind of a real game changer of a kind of event of any kind, because it also kind of signaled, we can do this ourselves. We don't have to import from outside. We have talent, we have stories, from the Gulf. Let's, give them to our audiences and then export them to the world.
And I would, as an observer, you created this platform, this opportunity, this showcase that released, energized all this existing talent, correct? I mean, it was there. And so that's that's on one side of it, but also it seems like when you got to the other side, there's an audience for this significant, so as this nexus, that you created here, not only to give these artists an opportunity, but they created their work, and there were people who really were very interested in seeing the work.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I have to say, it's not me alone. I was just part of a team,
right.
But it was a big group of people, and actually quite a few of the key players from Dubai Film Festival are now running the Red Sea Film Festival in Jeddah, which is in its third
we will
edition.
get there. We will get there.
Okay, we're on our way to that
again, because it's really fascinating to do this. So all right, so sorry to interrupt there, because I definitely want to get there. So
not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think I'm a passionate believer in people being able to see themselves on the screen and what that means. So if you're someone like me, or I assume you too, you've grown up in a world where you go and see films where people are speaking your language, and that you see yourself reflected on the screen, and you almost begin to take that for granted because of the ubiquity of that kind of media, right? But I mean, if you can sort of think of, I mean, one example we had a Kenyan film at Dubai Film Festival one year, and it was the first year we were showing a lot of films from Africa, and we were struggling a bit with the audience. So then us kind of programming team said to the box office, give us all 10 tickets, free tickets, and we'll get people into the cinema that really need to see these films. So we each took a bunch of tickets for very first-time filmmakers from across Africa that were showing their films in Dubai for the first time. And all the Arab films were always completely full, and all the English language and films from India were really full. But these ones were struggling a bit. So we took these tickets and we just went around in the hotels and places where we were frequenting, spotting people and just saying, hey, do you want to come see a film? And I gave a bunch of tickets to the security guards and valet people at the hotel next to the cinema, and said to them, hey, if you want to come and see this film, just if you clock off, come along, it's free. And they were like, really? And had to really sort of persuade them. They said, yeah, okay. And I remember seeing this guy the next day that was parking valet cars, and he just said, that he said, I've never seen anything like it. I saw myself in the cinema for the first time ever. The person on the screen spoke my language, my own language from Kenya, and he was me, because it was a film about a guy that leaves his village, that goes to the big city, that tries to make it big, and this kind of thing. And he was in tears, and he said, I've never had an experience like this ever in my life. And he said the film director was there, and I talked to him, and he'd had this kind of epiphany, and he said, I've seen films all my life from America and films from India, but I've never seen me. And I always remember that, because it was absolutely goosebumpy. And I kind of thought, right, everybody deserves the chance to see themselves on the screen. And we can never forget that kind of feeling of representation and the confidence that that gives you, and the way that culture can. At that time, I thought, this film has changed this guy's life, you know. And he said, "Can I go back tomorrow?" And you know, I can I can see myself. I like film now. I get it, you know. And it was amazing. So I thought, that's a light bulb moment, you know, and we we can replicate that across every art form.
Yeah,
It's all about representation.
it's a you know, as a white American male, you know, perhaps you're the most privileged species to walk the earth. You know, that's something that someone like me, it doesn't immediately hit you. Certainly, because obviously there's so much, you know, expectation, privilege involved, things you're not even aware of, you're not thinking about. But I can, you know, I can see that and understand and recognize that how meaningful that would be when you stop and step back and look at how pervasive one perspective is. So Art Jameel. So you and thank you for that. That's just a wonderful drawing of the time and the place and the power and the energy involved and the really significant and dynamic role that played in not only just in, say, you know, just the sector, but the culture and self-perceptions and that sort of thing. So you became director of Art Jameel in Dubai.
Yeah. So yeah, I worked parallel to Dubai Film Festival, and then it became my full-time position at Art Dubai. So this was the art fair that started in 2006. Yeah, so then I was working in Dubai for Badoon magazine, all these various different, you know, hats with the film festivals and everything. And then I moved into being director of the art fair, and from 2010 to 2016. So that was a really interesting time when also, you know, in parallel to this, the story of Art Jameel was starting, because I mean, Art Jameel goes back 75 years. The Jameel family have been involved in philanthropy in Saudi and around the world. But Art Jameel as a sort of branded entity began in the early 2000s as well. So this was a kind of part of this parallel movement. You know, you could see the development of Art Jameel. That's when the Jameel gallery at the V&A started, which is the V&A Museum in London. It's their Islamic galleries, which are some of the most kind of prominent Islamic art galleries in the world. And alongside that, the Jameel Art Prize, which is a prize for artists from around the world that are inspired by Islamic design and Islamic art traditions. So this was kind of launched at the same time. And then you also had in parallel the Edge of Arabia movement. So that was something that Fadi Jameel, the founder of Art Jameel, was very heavily involved in, alongside Ahmed Martyr and Abdul Nasser Garem and Stephen Stapleton, so a British artist and two Saudi artists. This began at the same time as well. So the world was starting to kind of pick up a little bit about what was happening in Saudi through the prism slightly of international activities, and also through Art Dubai itself. So Art Dubai was where Atha Gallery, the leading gallery from Saudi Arabia that's based in Jeddah, where they had their international sort of debut. So Atha Gallery brought Saudi artists to the platform of Art Dubai, which was this, you know, international art fair that's attended by the international art world once a year every March. It's actually next week, so it's back again. So good timing. And so there were all these kinds of parallel things happening at the same time. And also this kind of, just to the kind of backdrop even further, was really an understanding on the part of the international art world that, you know, it wasn't all about London, Paris, New York, which tends to be the kind of assumption of the art world. There was a kind of realization that actually there were these other capitals around the world. Art Dubai was the first art fair in Asia to set up in 2006. And then after that, you had art fairs coming in Hong Kong, in Delhi. So there was this kind of proliferation across the rest of the world, and this sort of awakening from big museums and the art world and the art market across Europe and North America, that there was this other art world that had always been there. And actually artists from the global north had been sort of mining the global south for inspiration for a very long time. This exchange had been going on. but it meant that this kind of world was opening up at the same time. And then I knew obviously of Art Jameel's work, and I knew of the extraordinary philanthropy of the Jameel family for many years. I mean, they're absolutely renowned globally for their role in promoting art from the Middle East, and also with Community Jameel, which is Art Jameel's sister organization, with looking at social welfare and education, and nowadays also looking at the climate crisis and what we can do about that. So this extraordinary family of philanthropists, 3 generations of philanthropists, and I just happened to sit next to Ferdi Jameel at a dinner at some point in 2016, and we got chatting about education and the arts and what the arts can do for learning. And this is a big sort of passion of mine, and I didn't know at that time that Ferdi Jameel was even more kind of, you know, dedicated and knowledgeable about that kind of field. So we just sort of struck up a conversation, and by the end of the dinner, you know, we were cooking up all sorts of plans for Art Jameel. So then when he said, do you want to come and be director, and we're just embarking on a whole new, you know, phase for Art Jameel. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I loved my job at Art Dubai, but this was absolutely irresistible opportunity and a total honor, really.
What a fortuitous evening. That's
I know.
for all of us. So that is an extraordinary family. I don't know the family. I've known of Jameel, and you know, for actually, to be honest, for a long time, I sort of paid attention to the Babrisk Jameel, you know, because the sort of entrepreneurial things they were doing. Again, this is well before Vision 2030 and the focus on, you know, entrepreneurial and training and that sort of thing. They were doing this private initiative because they thought it was important, and of course, the art outreach.
Certainly.
So he sold you, and it didn't sound like a hard sell. To come get what's the relationship between the Dubai Art Jameel and the Jeddah Art Jameel? I mean, under the same umbrella, I guess. But I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess there's a kind of common thread that runs through all the Jameel philanthropy endeavors. You mentioned Babrisk, which is super important. You know, Community Jameel has a base in Saudi and also a base internationally, and then there's Art Jameel as well. So, and many other initiatives with scholarships and all kinds of programs. But I guess the common thread, which our board always emphasizes, is kind of how can you create impact on society? How can you make a difference? And how can you shift communities and societies into new ways of interacting and of living together? So there's a kind of common thread that runs through everything, even if it's from a scholarship for somebody to go to university, or something like the incredible labs that exist at MIT, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, for example. So there are kind of, you know, very different ways of applying this, but even through the arts, it's the same common thread of real impact and community-oriented impact. So this runs through everything. My role is director of Art Jameel. So you can imagine Art Jameel as a kind of umbrella foundation that contains the team. We're almost 60 people now. When I joined in 2016, we were 3, so we've had this extraordinary growth. And so the kind of the incredible talent that works for Art Jameel, the ethos of what we do, and our kind of global presence through online activities, as well as things like our collections and our libraries. So there's a kind of mother foundation, and then under that sits 2 sites or venues, if you like, the Jameel Arts Centre in Dubai, and now, as of a year ago, High Jameel in Jeddah. So these 2 institutions, and I think what's interesting, and what one of the things I love about Art Jameel is that from the very beginning, and you know, for the past 20 more years, Art Jameel didn't have a base. You know, it was always working in collaboration with other people, and so it goes back to a similar model to Innova that I mentioned at the beginning, the London organization that I worked in the late 90s, of how can you kind of, you know, work with other people and go in here and go in there and really get across your ethos and bring up other kinds of entities with you as you grow. So that kind of sense of collaboration and exchange is absolutely in our DNA for Art Jameel, even though we now have these 2 incredible buildings and sites and museums to kind of take care of and to grow. So I was very lucky at joining Art Jameel just in 2016, when the foundations for each of the two sites were already there, actual physical foundations. And we were working with the architects on imagining these two buildings and what they can deliver to each of their cities. So it was a really incredibly, kind of time to really think utopian, which we've tried to hang on to as a team and kind of think, how do you really make a difference? How can we make sure that whatever we do is pioneering, that's kind of really delivering something new to our cities and our communities, doesn't replicate what's there already, and is fleet-footed and responsive and listens and tries to provide. So that's our kind of working model. And and I'm hugely lucky. I work with a whole bunch of incredible people. I've never actually listed the nationalities of the team, but we're around 60 people, I imagine, from at least 20, 30 different places. So a lot have grown up in the UAE and in Saudi, and bring all that kind of knowledge with them, but also bring such a diversity of experience. So it's an incredibly exciting and thought-provoking kind of environment to work in.
I think it's important to hear conversations like this. There are Jameel families out there. Obviously, this is an extraordinary example of a family with a purpose and a vision, and sort of an ego-less approach. Where we really want to get something, achieve something, and make a contribution. We're not particularly care who gets the credit, and you can accomplish so much when that happens. But there are other families like that, and I don't think that's something that people outside of Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, or elsewhere are fully aware of. But let's take you. Mm-hmm. You've referenced the Hey Jameel, which opened last year.
Yeah, that's right.
What is Hey Jameel?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, because I think it's so important, this kind of egoless philanthropy, and that I think that's such a good way of summing up the Jameels. I mean, I often try to sort of, when I meet people from in the art world and in the world of philanthropy and NGOs, they're a household name, but from the outside, people don't always quite clock on to their kind of significance. So, I tried to, we had a whole big group come from some of the museums in New York recently and in LA. And I kind of tried to say, well, if you think of the nature of, the Rockefellers or the Fords or these kinds of families, this is what the Jameels are in Saudi. So there's a kind of absolute kind of recognition of the name. And obviously Abdul Latif Jameel, the business, is incredibly well known and part of the fabric of every city in Saudi. So we planned these two institutions. Actually, the Hey Jameel in Jeddah was planned long before the center in Dubai, but Dubai kind of took off, and typical kind of Dubai construction story, went very, very quickly, and our center in Jeddah went slightly more slowly. But actually, then the timing with Jeddah turned out to be incredibly serendipitous, because it's hit this wave of development in Saudi of cultural opening up, which was incredibly lucky for us to hit that kind of moment. So in the end, it was as it was meant to be. So we looked at each city and thought, what does each city need? Dubai has the market, it has galleries, it has these sort of government models of a biennial in Sharjah, museums in Abu Dhabi, but the UAE doesn't have a kind of flexible contemporary museum that can showcase the kind of breadth of young artists. So we thought in Dubai, what we really need to do is a contemporary art museum. And then we also figured out that there's no kind of visual arts library, a free library where anyone can go, the curious can do their research anywhere in the Gulf. So we thought the Jameel Library should sit in Dubai, an open access library for everybody that focuses on Gulf studies, cultural books, telling the exhibition histories and the cultural histories of the Gulf. And that sits in Dubai. But in Jeddah, an incredibly vibrant city, a city that's, really a kind of a place that for centuries has been a place that kind of processes and introduces pilgrims from around the world to Saudi. So incredibly kind of cosmopolitan city as well. And a young people, Saudi in generally has a young population. That's very much the case in Jeddah as well, and a very creative space. So we knew there were artists, fashion designers, filmmakers, theatre enthusiasts. Everybody was there in Jeddah doing their thing, and had been for some time before the reopening up and this new kind of renaissance of today. But people were kind of hidden in their own spot. So what we thought Jeddah really needed was a creative hub, a place that brings all those different art forms together, that's a kind of informal, dynamic, entrepreneurial, kind of very vibrant kind of meeting point, basically a gathering space. So Art Jameel is quite a large scale building. It's around 17,000 square meters. Obviously, for people that speak Arabic, Hai or Hey is a kind of reference to neighborhood. So it's really about a kind of community neighborhood that brings together all the different creative disciplines in one spot. So and the design is by this fantastic architectural firm called YY, who are kind of part Japanese, part Lebanese, based in Dubai. They just won the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale last year, so they're on the up. They're award-winning, incredible thinkers, and they said, let's create a building that is entirely open on the inside. All the kind of buildings, congregate around a central courtyard, so it almost feels like a kind of typical Jeddah house, but on a much bigger scale. We won't put windows on the outside. We'll respect that this is a residential neighborhood. And also, once you're into the sort of central part of Hai, you're part of a community. It's almost like a kind of big group hug, for the creative industries, bringing everyone together in one spot.
Now that's good architecture, if you can get a group hug effect.
Exactly. And it's entirely open. It's free. Anybody can walk in off the street. But once you're in it, has slightly kind of, you feel protected in it, which is great for the arts. It's kind of a great sort of nurturing kind of quality. And then obviously Art Jameel runs the whole space, but we run it all, but we only operate our own not-for-profit initiatives in around sort of half the building, 2/3 maybe. And that includes High Cinema, which we can come on to because it's kind of comes full circle from what we were talking about earlier. High Arts, which is our exhibition block, studios for artists, an incredible multi-purpose space that anybody from the community can rent, and that's been home to farmers markets and high-end exhibitions, to conferences, to meetings, to everything. And then we have a specialist children's zone, High Explorers, which is a kind of young persons and children's kind of arts specialist center. And then the rest is all given over to incredible Jeddawi creative entrepreneurs. So everything from Aish Academy, which is a baking school. So the smell of croissants kind of, comes over the courtyard.
Boy, this is a group hug.
It is a group hug, exactly. Completely. What else do we have? The incredible comedy club, which has been running for many years in Jeddah, but now they finally have a home of their own. And Fennec, they do classes in everything from confidence building for teenagers to public speaking for business people. So they're all about how does comedy and performance open up a space for everybody. It's the one rule that if you're a high resident, as we call the kind of tenants, you have to do something for the public. You can't just squirrel away yourself and work every day. It's all about delivering something back to the community. So Muhtaraf, the publishing house, for example, they publish books and they do all their editing and designing in their space, but they also run workshops for other people. Atha Gallery is there with an incredible immersive art kind of center. Oh, who else have I forgotten? Such an incredible range of different kind of enterprises. We have 10 different tenants now that are part of that space. So the dream is, you can show up to Art Jameel, you have the best coffee, the best croissants, fantastic F&B, you can see a film, you can see an exhibition, you can do a class, you can hang out in the courtyard with your friends, attending a music concert. It's just a kind of whole encompassing world. And we're so lucky. Jeddah has taken us to their hearts and has been incredibly supportive, and it's a blast.
Somebody that I will be in Jeddah March 12, 13. Would
Oh,
love
amazing.
would love to come
Yeah,
see it. Absolutely would love to come see it. It sounds like
fantastic.
a destination, a show place, an incubator, everything. A hug.
Exactly. Yeah, a hug, definitely. Hugs on tap. Yeah, we'd love to, yeah, we'd love to invite you. And if you're there, I don't know whether it sounds like your trip is a set date, but as an example of the kind of festivals we do on from March the 1st to the 4th, we have Hai Matsuri. Matsuri means festival in Japanese, and it's a Japanese themed festival. So there's a market with incredible food. There's all these Japanese products. There's drumming displays, music. There's a film festival. So it's again this kind of idea of how you really open up to the community and do something for everyone.
Well, let me ask a big question. And you're extraordinarily well equipped to address this, but I don't want to ask too much. The Jeddah art scene. What is the Jeddah art scene today? How is it evolving? Can you put it in context between now and 5 years ago? However, how is it progressing?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure your listeners are well aware of this kind of absolute uh, what I used the word renaissance before, but a kind of revolution in terms of how culture is perceived within Saudi and how it's projecting itself to the outside world. So the scene that we have now is wholly different from 2 years ago, let alone 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. I mean, we have to be really careful not to sort of overstate the newness. Cinemas are returning, not being invented for the first time. Obviously, there have been people working, particularly in Jeddah, which was always known as the kind of cultural hub of Saudi for many, many years. A whole body of local families used to run the Saudi Art Council, doing this exhibition 2139 every year for the last 10 years. The first time I went to Saudi was for the 2139 10, 12 years ago, something like that. And so there's been people that have been working on the ground, let alone all the creatives that we just mentioned before. They've been getting on with their thing, through for decades. So it's not that it's new. It's just there's a particular sort of real switch in the way that the government is supporting the arts, and that this kind of coming out into the public of the arts and the international attention is pretty much unprecedented. So across Saudi, there's, the Ministry of Culture has set up in the last couple of years, incredible body of people that are really pushing forward across everything. And they include the culinary, just to pick up on our croissants again, they include everything from the culinary and within culture through to visual arts, architecture and design, film, performance, everything. So every single sector of the arts is being looked at. There's a body of people there in the government who are pushing forward on that. ISRA, I'm sure you've talked, I think Todd is involved in ISRA, and other people that you probably had them on the program, working in the Eastern Province, obviously for many years as well, doing incredible things there. So, and then in Riyadh, you have the Misk Art Foundation, as well as all the government-led activities as well. So there's this kind of Eastern Province, Riyadh in the center, Jeddah on the west, that are these kind of three centers. And then obviously Abha and everything happening in the south is also kind of gaining recognition. And there's a new kind of, amongst all the different institutions and players talking to each other, a new kind of push to make sure that we're also doing things across Saudi. And of course, we should mention Alullah, which is, I don't know whether you've had anybody on the program yet from Alullah, but that is really being designated as the kind of art hub, and incredible things are happening there. So looking at the kind of history of archaeology, as well as going forward, what's going to, involving contemporary artists in reimagining that incredible site. So
yes.
It's an incredibly vibrant time in Saudi. It's unbelievable. And then, I think sitting in Jeddah, there used to be a little bit of a conception of, okay, the sort of art focus has shifted slightly towards Riyadh. You have an incredible Biennale in Riyadh, the Diriyah Biennial. There's a lot of kind of talent gravitating towards the capital. But Jeddah, didn't take this lying down, and has kind of, kind of kicking back, saying, let's also celebrate this kind of cultural history of Jeddah. Obviously, Jeddah famously has more sculpture across its city than any other city in the world, most of which was commissioned in the 60s by the mayor of Jeddah at that time, Mohammed Farsi. So there's a long history there of really thinking about culture in Jeddah and celebrating this kind of history of pilgrimage and position as a port city looking out to the world, being very open. So there's a lot of kind of history there to play on. And Art Jameel is the first kind of non-governmental initiative in Saudi of its kind. And we're hoping that other private families and initiatives come along and sort of support as well. But then we also sit alongside these amazing government initiatives. And at the moment, we have the Islamic Arts Biennial, which is the kind of counterpart to the Contemporary Art Biennial in Riyadh. And for listeners that think, what is a biennial? It's a very sort of art term, but it's basically a big exhibition that happens every 2 years. And you see in the Islamic Arts Biennial, again, the first of its kind in the world. But I mean, of course, this is going to happen in Saudi, and Saudi is the natural home for an exhibition like this. It pairs incredible treasures from Islamic art and design treasures. So what was my favorite object? Oh, this incredible Hajj passport from 1190 in the Gregorian calendar. So you can imagine these are absolute treasures that they've sourced from all over the world, including incredible museums in Greece and other places, as well as things that have come from across Saudi. And they paired that with contemporary art and architecture commissions. So inviting today's leading artists and architects to come up with new works that kind of are in conversation with these other works. So if anybody's in Jeddah, I really highly recommend to go to this, because even if you're not an art fan, you don't have to know anything about art and architecture or Islamic traditions to find this absolutely mind-blowing. And the location, it's in the Hajj terminal. So it's the site is this incredible design by SOM, who are amazing American architects, working with a Bangladeshi architect and others that, they built this in the early 80s. It's an incredible site, and it's now used for this kind of art show, as well as still being a working Hajj terminal. So that gives a little bit of an idea of kind of what's going on. And then High is there as a permanent fixture in the city. There are many other things popping up. So, and of course, listeners will know that, Saudi is an incredibly hospitable place. Anybody that shows an interest in the arts and culture scene there is so well looked after. There are so many people that are willing to take you on tours, give you advice. It's an incredibly welcoming and open place, and people are just there. The artists there are just incredibly excited to be connected now with the world and able to sort of exchange in this way that they never have done before.
Just amazing. Just so you know, on the 966, we celebrate small achievements. Early on, the ability to pronounce Biennale was a big achievement for us.
Yeah, so I know. It's one of those things that you don't think about, and then you realize, okay, we stole this from the Italians for no particular reason, and just put it into our vocabulary.
But since we cover Saudi so closely, all of a sudden it was exploding. There were biennales everywhere. But it is interesting, and you make an interesting point. And I don't want to keep it too long. But you referenced the art scene in Jeddah as not being new, because exactly what you say. It's been there. There's a authentic and organic long-term history of it. It is a bit new in Riyadh. More so, but I think it's really fascinating that when you point out these different centers, and you also mention the Southwest and Abha, because we had Sean Foley on the show, and he talked about how significant cultural incubating occurred down there.
Completely.
And so it played a big role too. So it is interesting how you see the regional dynamics, because that just is going to energize it more and more, and you're just going to be more creativity coming out of all of it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, and Sean's actually he did a music event with us at Art Jameel, so we have a connection with him. And no, absolutely. And I think what you can see now, which is again a kind of very much a new movement, but comes from this history, is that the government is incredibly committed. I mean, if we think of globally, what is the significance of this? Where are people building museums for the first, in this kind of way, where are people establishing cinemas and a film industry. There's, at the moment, globally, I don't think there's anywhere like Saudi. I mean, obviously, you have a huge private museum building program in China, but that's been going on for quite a number of years. But the way that Saudi has really kind of exploded in terms of activity in the arts is, I think it's pretty much unique in the world. So there's a lot of international interest, and I think it's, there are things that we have to sort of think about and contend with. Everything is moving at an incredibly fast pace. A lot of the bigger known artists who are able to produce big works on scale, for everything from Desert X in Alula to the big biennales that are coming, they're finding themselves very stretched. So there's a kind of, there's a sort of awareness that this speed cannot maybe be sustained forever, but everybody wants to sort of jump on the train and not miss it and be part of it, But I think in places like Art Jameel, we're kind of seeing like what can we bring to the scene that's different? How can we kind of contribute? And one way we're trying to do that is all by providing us something of a sort of counterweight, saying also, let's take advantage of this incredibly exciting moment, but let's also slow down. Let's think, how do we put these kind of foundations for the long term? So we just, for example, launched a research program where every year we're awarding a scholar with a grant to develop a kind of and write about and study histories of Saudi, so exhibition histories of Saudi, because you speak to contemporary artists and they say, well, I'm moving so fast, I don't have time to look at what happened in the 80s, let alone the 70s or 60s or 50s in Saudi. So this history could very quickly kind of slip through our fingers and get lost. So we're commissioning scholars and writers to look at the history, to write about it, to do that in Arabic, to make that open source kind of research. So we put that all on our website. People can come and sort of read about the history and tap into it. So also kind of thinking about how you put down foundations for the long term and provide artists of all kinds of a place to sort of hang out and develop their work in a really kind of considered way. So, you've got to be on the train, but you also need to sort of make sure that there are long-term endeavors there. And again, we're just kind of thinking, how do we plug the gaps? That's our role. Create impact, be pioneering, kind of move into different spaces, listen to the community, respond, and make sure that whatever we're doing is complementing all the other initiatives going on. So but it's an amazingly collegiate atmosphere. I mean, if we just take High Cinema, for example, we launched High Cinema in December, so it's a very new part of High, and it's Saudi's first bespoke independent cinema. So ITHRA has been doing amazing things showing independent film for some time, but this is a kind of slightly different take. It's a 2-screen cinema complex with a research space, archive space, and educational spaces as well. And we're showing, the idea is to show films from all over the world that are kind of independent art house films, documentaries, things in different languages, and also to show Saudi film and encourage Saudi filmmakers to come and show their works here. So it's been an incredibly exciting endeavor. But of course, being the first something is not always easy. And at the moment, Saudi is, funnily enough, set up for multiplexes. If you employ 2,000 people and have 12 screens showing, the big blockbusters, you can get a license, no problem. If you're kind of trying to do something quite different, this is a kind of emergent idea and art form. So we've had the most fantastic relationship with the government on this, where they've said, okay, this is an interesting concept. We actually want to see art house cinemas across the country. Let's work together to figure out, we'll use High Cinema as a kind of pilot project. We'll learn, let's work on it together and figure out what does a cinema like this need. So it's really interesting to be in this role where, as an independent organization, we have this kind of relationship with government where we're figuring things out together. So that kind of very collegiate atmosphere of what does the country need? How can we all work together to provide it? Let's have an open forum. What are you doing? I can do this to complement what you're doing. I mean, that again, I think that's very unusual. If I speak to colleagues in New York or London or Paris, they don't have that kind of relationship with government and with colleagues anymore. So I guess we're putting down the building blocks together, and it's that's a really exciting kind of endeavor, and one that's very open with conversations. So yeah, tremendously exciting. At the moment at High Cinema, we have a whole season that's dedicated to children's films. So we're doing, yeah, it's super exciting. So we're saying to all the families and kids, we're doing some free screenings to get everybody really excited about cinema and independent filmmaking and real cinema. And then we're also doing programs with schools. So schools bring their classes, they see a range of different animations and animated films in different languages from across the world. They do a behind the scenes at the cinema kind of tour. So they kind of see, what is a projection booth? What is a 35mm film? How does a cinema kind of work? And then they do an art class after it in which they create characters that they saw in the films. So it's a kind of 360 experience for kids. And it's so funny. All the teachers, all the team at High Jameel just keep saying, I wish I'd had this when I was a kid.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's brilliant marketing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's also in many of these kind of things that are new and pioneering in different countries around the world. If you get to the kids and get the kids enthusiastic, they bring the parents who might be harder to persuade sometimes, and then you can kind of really create change, which is really exciting.
Antonia Carver, director, Art Jameel. On behalf of our listeners and our viewers, I just want to say this was such a treat and such a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sitting down with us at the 966. This was just really, really priceless. Terrific.
Thank you so much I really appreciate it a lot. We're all about, trying to get the message across about how art and culture can transform society and, really bring people together and enable exchange in an entirely different way to any other field. So it's all about communication. So I really appreciate the chance to come and chat to you. And any listeners, if they want to check us out, our website is artjameel.org. We're on Instagram with High Jameel, Jameel Art Centre and Art Jameel. And we absolutely welcome all visitors to our centres. And there are many other ways to interact and get in touch wherever you are in the world.